Get started. My name is Marissa Gilman, and I will be your moderator for this exciting session on innovative strategies to reach and serve the base of the pyramid. This webcast is brought to you by the Zayed Sustainability Prize, UAE's pioneering annual global award in sustainability. This award recognizes and rewards the achievements of those who are driving impactful, innovative, and inspiring sustainability solutions across 5 distinct categories: health, food, energy, water, and global high schools. The prize is accepting applications through June 11th, and we hope all of you will consider applying or passing the opportunity on to someone that you know. I'm really excited to welcome our guest today, Professor Stu Hart. Stu is one of the world's top authorities on the implications of environment and poverty for business strategy. According to Bloomberg Businessweek, he is one of the founding fathers of the Base of the Pyramid economic theory, as head of the Base of the Pyramid Global Network. Stu is founder and president of the Enterprise for a Sustainable World, a think tank and nonprofit dedicated to tackling the world's most pressing social and environmental problems. He's a professor emeritus in Sustainable Global Enterprise at Cornell University and also co-founded the Sustainable Innovation MBA program at the University of Vermont. I'll start off with a few questions for Stu, and then we'll also save time for questions from you all. So please feel free to enter any questions into the chat, and we will get to them at the end of this conversation. So Stu, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. Well, we are thrilled to have you. And so we wanted to start and chat about the base of the pyramid theory. You are well known for being one of the founding creators of this concept. And I'm curious if you'd be able to explain what that theory is and why it's an important concept for organizations interested in sustainability.
Yeah, sure. So the idea behind base of the pyramid is, it's particularly focused on the role of business in the world, right? That 20 years ago when we first, it was my colleague C.K. Prahalad and I first wrote this piece called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. Back then there were 6 billion people in the world, and 4 billion of them earn less than $2 or $3 a day. So first of all, it constituted then and still constitutes the vast majority of people in the world, right, are still, at least from an income point of view, are still poor. Now that's changed, I'll comment on that in a moment, but back then, 20 years ago, that was the case, 4 billion plus people earning less than $2 or $3 a day. And business really did not see any role for itself. It was like a global division of labor. Poverty that's a job for governments and philanthropists and NGOs. So our idea was, well, is it possible for us to scope a role for business through the business rather than just thinking about it philanthropically? And for a few reasons. One, the top of the pyramid, sort of rich world markets were becoming pretty saturated, and they still are. In other words, there aren't so many new rich people being added to the world. So you have just highly competitive red ocean marketplaces for companies that compete for a couple 100 million or 300 million customers. There were and still are emerging markets that's growing, right? In other words, kind of the emerging markets of the world, increasingly urban, right? In developing countries, mega cities and that sort of thing. But even there, there are real cost barriers to just trying to extend current products and try to sell them, either low cost. But the existing product and business model often wasn't appropriate. And not only that, there were all kinds of potential environmental tipping points just in terms of resource use and waste and pollution to transposing current first world product systems to the emerging markets, let alone, those in rural areas, where it was just entirely inappropriate. So the base of the pyramid, viewed through that lens, opens up, one, opportunity to serve a whole lot more people, but two, in order to do that, it requires a completely new way of thinking about doing business, an innovative business model, and a dramatically lower cost position, but also the opportunity to bring in new leapfrog, disruptive, inherently clean, even sometimes regenerative technologies in renewable energy, in point of use water treatment, in inclusive health, in all kinds of areas that are directly relevant to this prize.
And so being able to tackle the base of the pyramid, a company would need to rethink the way that they've been approaching business, at least up to that point.
Exactly. So base of the pyramid is a driver of, in a Clayton Christensen kind of sense, if people know Clay's work, tragically recently passed away. But base of the pyramid is a source of disruptive innovation, right? So, and most companies sort of struggle with disruptive innovation, right? They would far prefer, it's the power of incumbency, to continuously improve their current model, through product extensions and, maybe trying to expand the existing market. But base of the pyramid is about creating an entirely new market in space that had previously been either unserved or underserved.
And what's interesting in your work is that there are two factors that you've identified, namely poverty and the environment, as having great implications on business strategy. And I'm curious your thoughts on how entrepreneurs and companies should be taking this into account.
Yeah, so I'd say in the early going, the assumption was even those kind of corporations and in many cases entrepreneurs that were convinced, right, that there was potential opportunity, business opportunity, not just as philanthropists, still took the attitude that, if we can design a widget or a gadget or a product and strip the cost out of it, have it be ultra low cost, a really low cost solar cooker or a really low cost solar panel or a really low cost water treatment, whatever it might be, that's really all we need, right? This is really just a question of getting the price down, to a level that people could, quote, afford, right? We would go and do marketing studies in rural villages or urban slums, figure out, what the household expenditure pattern is, try to create a product that serves a need that we've identified, right? At a price point that we think or know, at least in conventional marketing terms, that these people can afford, and then we'll sell it to them, right? I mean, I think that was very much the mindset. And I think what we learned, fairly quickly within a few years was that whole approach just does not work, right? Sort of trying to innovate from on high, kind of step back, look at the problem. Now, it's perfectly fine to kind of diagnose problems from a distance, using science. That, yeah, we can see that there's a malnutrition problem. We can see that there's a lack of protein. We can see that, that lack of sanitation and clean water is a problem, and so forth, right? We can see what the health problems are in this. And so I think it makes perfect sense to focus on problems to solve from the standpoint of the developed world or the corporations or companies or entrepreneurs that are looking at it. But where we run into problems is when you try to translate the solution to that problem in terms that only make sense to the entrepreneur. In other words, we diagnose the problem, then we come up with a solution, in our R&D labs, and then we try to sell it to people, assuming we know what they need and what would be deemed as important from their standpoint. That turns out to be a huge mistake. So what we learned pretty quickly is to have any chance at being successful, it's critically important to develop a set of skills in a company or as an entrepreneur, whereby you're able to become embedded and become a partner in a process of co-creation of a value proposition and a business model that makes sense to people in the communities themselves. In other words, they have to be engaged in the process, not only in the design of the artifact itself, if there is one, but they also have to be, closely engaged in helping to stand up the business model itself. And ideally, the business model would be one that benefits them directly in the form of livelihood generation and so forth. In other words, it's not just about selling cheap stuff to poor people. It's about creating a completely new value proposition and business model that makes sense and is pulled in, by people in communities because they deem it as really important from their perspective.
And I'm curious, tactically speaking, what are successful models that you've seen, whether at a multinational company or at an entrepreneurial level, of being able to embed themselves and being able to get the local insights and being able to co-create? In a good example, what does that look like? Right.
Well, probably the best known example of just sort of exponential takeoff when it comes to this is the cell phone story, right? Mm-hmm. So, beginning with a Grameen phone in Bangladesh, but now that has kind of spun out all over the world, and now it's about internet connectivity, not just cell phone. But I think what makes that, where we learned a lot from the experience of, say, Grameen Phone in Bangladesh, which now serves 95% of the rural villages in Bangladesh, right, have connectivity. And Grameen Phone is one of the largest corporations in Bangladesh and is also one of the most profitable. Mm-hmm. But the reason that happened is because when you think about it, cell phones and then, by implication later, internet connectivity have the aspects of being embedded built into them, right? They are essentially an enabling platform. People can use that technology to do whatever they think is important from their point of view, right? So it's naturally embedded, right? It's an enabling platform. So I think we learned pretty quickly that's what really allowed kind of rural telephony and cell phone service to scale so quickly, because people could make of it what they deemed important. They weren't nothing was being rammed down their throat, right? Other than, there had to be a viable way for them to get access to the device itself and to connectivity. And so I think then as time went on, you began to see other kind of more product-oriented kinds of companies realize that was going to be really important. Unless it was something that was just extremely cheap and affordable and used on a repeat basis, then you began to see companies who realize the importance of this sort of co-creative approach. I'll give you an example in the food space. We're going back now 10 years or so, but I think it's an apt example. There's a company that used to be owned by DuPont called Soleil. And Soleil is a soy protein company, right? So in the food space, they make, essentially, if you look at their product, it looks like white powder, right? And they were becoming a global company. They already had a strong presence in North America and in Europe, but they had spent about 10 years in India without much success, right? They just had not been able to crack that market, even though they knew from looking at it scientifically, right? So sort of the bird's eye view, the science view told them there was a serious protein malnutrition in India, but their repeated attempts to try to just market this low-cost protein just failed, right? And even when they assigned people in their R&D facility in St. Louis to try to come up with recipes, which they actually did, it failed, right? Because the truth is that soy really wasn't much part of Indian cooking. Mm-hmm. So we got involved working with them, applying a process that we had developed called the Base of the Pyramid Protocol, which is an organized kind of embedding and co-creation business process, where you actually then engage people from the company where they spend time. In this case, it was both in an urban slum environment and in a rural village, to try to develop a value proposition and a business model that works beyond just trying to sell them this product. Long story short, after having gone through that, what came out of it was, in the slum environment, for example, a business model that was called the Soleil Culinary Rooftop Garden. Working with local people, what we discovered was, that they said, yeah, we're interested in working with you on this soy protein thing. It's not, we don't really know how to cook with it, but we're willing to learn. But it would be great if we could, sort of make this a bigger payoff than just that, right? Like, we have some of these buildings in the slum environment are well constructed. It's not all tin roofs, but we don't have anywhere to take our kids because it was mostly women that were engaged. We also don't have anywhere to buy fresh produce. We have to figure out how we have to leave, and leave our neighborhood, leave the entire slum we live in, and in order to go source fresh produce, which takes time, is expensive. It'd be great if we could solve, these problems. We'd love to work with you on that. So in other words, part of it was identifying a problem. The other was using a resource that was local. And so the people from the company and the local partners realized that, hey, it's not hard at all to get access to firmly built, well-built buildings, oftentimes schools and other kinds of government buildings, but also others, where you could lease access to the roof to create, a safe, clean environment for kids to play in, and then also set up a little cooking facility, a kitchen where you could have women come, their kids could play, it was safe. There were hydroponic fresh produce providers there where you could buy fresh produce, and they could experiment cooking with soy at the same time, right? At this cooking facility, there was a chef who's like the R&D agent and sales agent for the company. So long story short, and you would want to figure out which women were known as the best cooks in the neighborhood, and to have them come up with a recipe which then spread like wildfire. And before you know it, people are buying soy protein. I tell that story only because this is a case where just trying to market affordable protein to people and they need it, falls on deaf ears, doesn't go anywhere. But if you are able to kind of co-create a value proposition and a business model that works, that provides value from the point of view of people in the community itself, that's the way you really get traction when it comes to serving the base of the pyramid.
Yeah, I think that's a great example too of one of the tenets of entrepreneurship, of push versus pull, creations, creating something that people actually want and making sure that it's embedded and that it's based on the person's lived experience.
Exactly. If it's not important, useful, compelling from their point of view, then you don't have anything.
Right.
They know that this is a solution to a problem they have, but that and a nickel will buy you a cup of coffee.
Right. And taking a step, I guess, above, I wanted to speak about your book, Capitalism at the Crossroads. And in this book, you're discussing the need for business to shift from shareholder-based capitalism to stakeholder-based capitalism, which should ground new strategies for identifying sustainable products, technology, business models, et cetera. And I'm curious, especially because we have on the line a number of innovators and entrepreneurs and people thinking about how to use business as a tool for good. What types of changes should companies be making to better align themselves with stakeholder-based capitalism? And also, why does it matter?
Yeah. So kind of coming back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, right? I mean, I would say especially in the American, we'll call it the U.S. Anglo form of capitalism, right? Maybe things are a little different in Northern Europe or in Asia, but the version of capitalism we've been practicing in the United States and in the UK for the last 40 years has been so dominated by short-termism that it's been really difficult to kind of do anything that looks as though you're kind of stretching out, reaching out. We were talking about the idea of disruptive innovation earlier. And I think this is a classic example of how important it is looking forward to, and perhaps we're on the cusp of the end of the age of market fundamentalism and shareholder primacy. We may be on the cusp of that. COVID is horrible, but if it ends up being kind of the punctuation point, where since the 80s, that's been our world, right? Is kind of shareholder primacy, market fundamentalism, share price is the best measure of the success of the company and its strategy. And the way you compensate executives is with stock options, right? So everything is therefore driven by driving stock price in the short term. That is the enemy of the kind of capitalism we're talking about, right? But I think even within that framework, right, this idea of the sustainable value framework, which I've developed in that book, it recognizes, and even people, even leaders of corporations, and even people in the financial community, analysts and asset managers and so forth, will freely admit that the only way that in a business you can create value in the long term is to not only efficiently manage today's business and eliminate risk and so forth, but also to make investments to grow tomorrow's capabilities and competencies and create tomorrow's markets. I mean, if all you do is continuously improve what you already know how to do, eventually you fly that plane into the ground, right? That it can't last forever. And even the most, even analysts and asset managers know that to be true. And in the end, it's companies that are able to kind of do that while they're attending to the apparent needs of analysts and asset managers for short-termism. It's the companies that are able to do both that really thrive for the long term. So I think now, kind of looking forward, perhaps coming out of COVID, we'll realize how much we undervalued purpose, how much we undervalued kind of reaching to solve real problems in the world that in many cases take some time, for you to realize the kind of the business goal associated with that. So, so in the framework I developed, there are the kind of sustainability geared strategies that focus around the continuous improvement of today's business. Those are important things like eco-efficiency and pollution prevention and product stewardship and stakeholder engagement and, kind of thinking about sustainable sourcing and product take back and design for environment. Those are all important just with the products and markets that already exist. But you also at the same time have to be making investments in tomorrow's competencies, tomorrow's technologies. What new skills do we have to acquire as a company to be successful a decade from now? What are the markets of the future that we want to create, coming back to the idea of the base of the pyramid, and recognizing that those are probably going to take more than the typical time horizon for a new product introduction in our current market. So we have to have a different set of metrics to evaluate success when it comes to those types of strategies. And I think that's what we're finally realizing, right, is that having what we'll call global aspirations and quests, having goals, you see more and more companies now setting 10-year goals, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. What is it that we really want to accomplish in the world? What are the problems we want to solve in the world, looking 10 years out, right? And how do we quantify those, right? How will we know if we've had the kind of impact that we want to have when it comes to health and nutrition, or energy access, or clean water, or sanitation, or education, or whatever it might be? And then how do we track progress of that company toward realizing those goals? I think becomes increasingly important for the investment community. I mean, hopefully coming out of COVID, looking at those kind of metrics, it becomes increasingly important in driving share price, not just earnings per share and quarterly earnings.
Right. And something that we're seeing as well with COVID is that it's exacerbating inequality. It's affecting, people of color, it's affecting low income groups. And I'm curious, because I know in interviews even 5 years ago, inequality was something that you were talking about. I'm curious the role that you've observed business playing in this dynamic, as well as the role that you feel that business could play to undo some of the inequality that we're seeing be furthered by this disease.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and again, depending on which, kind of estimates or analysts you believe, I think there are some very believable, kind of forecasts from the UN, and the IFC and others that would suggest, I mean, this will be the first year that we turn back the poverty clock, right? That, for the past 20 years, at least income poverty has been going, extreme poverty, right, has been on the run, right? I mean, we've gotten it down to 600 million people or so in extreme poverty, defined, as $1.90. I'm not a big believer just in, income metrics as the definition of poverty, but still, I think it's important to kind of track that. There was a line of sight toward, the elimination of extreme poverty. Well, COVID could end up, we could have 50 million plus more people in extreme poverty, as a result of COVID. And by some estimates, another 500 million people, kind of cast back into poverty, even in the developed world, in the United States and Western Europe and other places, right? Not to mention Africa and Asia and Latin America. So in some ways, the COVID, re-emphasizes the importance, that we need to double down on inequality and poverty, right, as part of our business thinking, because it's going to become even more important. And, plus some of the dynamics that we thought were predictable, like increasing, inevitable urbanization, well, that we may be living in a somewhat different dynamic looking out over the next 5 or 10 years, more and more people leaving, especially urban slums and shantytowns, because maybe the opportunity just isn't there anymore. Already a mad dash back to rural village, kind of migrant workers and so forth that have been caught up in places like India and elsewhere. So we may be seeing that dynamic more and more. So I think there's that overall dynamic from the standpoint of a business person that if that doesn't get your antenna up, then I don't know what does. But then I think COVID has also just laid bare, the behavior of some companies, right? That companies that completely exploit and mistreat their workers now is becoming public, you know, whether it's meat packing industry or whatever it might be. But then it also lays bare some of the fragility of the whole model that we've had, like, you know, the level of corporate debt has never been higher, right? And so we see some of the early bankruptcies are those corporations that have just become so leveraged. They have so much leveraged debt that they can't make their debt payments. And it's because they use debt basically to do stock buybacks and leverage buyouts. You know, it's hedge fund stuff, right? And which feeds into the old model of shareholder primacy that I was talking about earlier. So I think COVID is going to expose companies that, you know, in tomorrow's world just don't work. You know, that they may have been able to get away with it, in the waning age of shareholder primacy, but coming out of COVID, they'll be exposed for being the badly run companies they really were.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's completely changing the market.
Yeah. And I also think that you'll see lots of companies in the last decade, you know, kind of took on the protective coloration of social impact and sustainability. You know, they have nice glossy reports and nice websites, and, you know, and they have volunteer programs and so forth. I don't mean to disparage those, but I think what you'll see coming out of COVID are those companies and those entrepreneurs and those ventures that were really serious about this, that really were purpose-driven, that really had made the resolution or, you know, sort of the regeneration of the environment, or the, you know, addressing kind of fundamental inequalities part of their core purpose and strategy, then they'll double down on that, right? That will just become more important coming out of COVID. For those companies for whom it was really sort of window dressing and greenwash, I think you'll see it slip away. So I think this will be a great sorting device.
Yeah, so companies where it was sustainability and making an impact was embedded in their DNA, those will be the ones that will be able to continue and rise to the top in this situation.
I mean, I think they would have a leg up in the environment that we're going to come into, and they'll make themselves known just by virtue of the fact, you know, I mean, even the small sample of the companies that I'm currently working with, right? And I have a clear bias toward the kind of companies I work with. That's absolutely the case, right? That this crisis only redoubles their commitment, right, to what they were already focused on in terms of using the company as a vehicle for trying to solve problems in the world. It's only gotten stronger. But there are plenty of other companies for whom that is not the case at all. You know, the kind of the sustainability commitments sort of get put to the sideline.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about the long-term, both the short-term and the long-term business implications, and where sustainability is able to embed itself now. And I want to make sure we have time for a question from the audience. This has been such an engaging conversation, Stu. You know, we have a question from someone. The question, they want to understand how innovators can find market opportunities that target the base of the pyramid. In Christensen's words, how do we map and find the non-consumption?
Oh my God! I mean, how do you
Solve our problems for us?
Right. I mean, I think it really has to do for a given innovator or entrepreneur, or even employee in a company. It should come from your own personal passion, right? Of what, in other words, if you have to go searching for it, then it may not really be. You haven't really found your passion yet when it comes to serving the underserved. You may have a technology, right? But that you're still in push mode, right? If you know you have this really cool, you know, kind of low cost renewable energy technology or water treatment or you know, health tech, whatever it might be, that's great. But you somehow you have to figure out there's going to be a social dimension to that beyond just the technology. And so it's finding the passion of where in the world, right? Kind of, and maybe it has to do with your, you know, where your family was from originally, or just a part of the world that fascinates you. But, you know, you need to find some passion for, actual people and communities that you want to figure out how to serve, right? So because there's no shortage of them.
So really embedding, tapping into your own personal passion and making sure that you're tackling something that you really care about.
Yep.
Great. Well, is there anything else that you had wanted to add, Stu? I know we're right at time, but I want to make sure that there was something that you had thought of that we weren't able to address.
Yeah, I think part of the other things when it comes to people who are motivated by this, kind of younger innovators, you know, kind of prospective entrepreneurs, is, you know, also finding your tribe, right? Sort of connecting up with others that are like-minded. So there's one place is net impact, right? Which is, you know, it's net impact has student chapters, you know, at business schools and universities, but it also has professional chapters, and it's becoming increasingly international, right? So, and you would find that members of net impact, people, you know, both student chapters and professional chapters, are going to be like-minded, right? Those would be the kinds of people that you would want to build networks with. So I think kind of getting into finding your tribe and getting into the right networks is really important. And then there are also skill building programs, right? So I can, you know, make a little bit of a plug for this program at Vermont, you know, that I've been involved in starting. If people are thinking about business school possibly, this is an MBA program that we built from the ground up called the Sustainable Innovation MBA, where we started with a clean sheet of paper and built a business education program that we think is appropriate to the 21st century, not the 1980s, right? I think most business schools are still stuck in an 80s model, shareholder primacy driven way of thinking about business. Even if they say, you know, we've got this concentration in social impact and so forth, the core is still rooted in the 80s, and you'll take some elective courses in the second year. Our program from start to finish has been redesigned to focus on what are the knowledge, skills, capabilities, tools, and network that business innovators and entrepreneurs need to be successful in the 21st century, to create tomorrow's environmentally sustainable, socially inclusive businesses. That's what the program's focused on. We also have an online program that we've spun off called Leading the Sustainability Transformation. It's a certificate program, kind of a badge certificate program. If people are interested in that, they can find some information about that as well.
Great, those sound like very relevant and important programs to have during this time. I want to thank you again so much. We so appreciate your time. And this is the end of our conversation. And I couldn't be more grateful to have the time to be able to chat with Professor Stuart Hart today. Thank you everyone for joining. Please, we really appreciate you taking the time. And please don't forget to spread the word about the fast approaching deadline for the Zayed Sustainability Prize on June 11th. For more information, you can visit www.zayedsustainabilityprize.com. And you can also follow the Zayed Sustainability Prize on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn for future webinars and for the latest information on this global competition. Thank you everyone, and please stay safe.
Thank you.